Welcome to the Crypto Intellect, where we break down the biggest crypto stories in a simple, clear, and powerful way so you can actually understand what is happening behind the charts and the headlines. Today we are diving into a story that feels bigger than price action, bigger than hype cycles, and even bigger than the usual crypto narratives. The headline says it all. XRP news. Today, Wall Street's door just opened for XRP. And if you think this is just another bullish rumor or another social media exaggeration, what we are about to unpack goes in a very different direction. Picture two massive financial worlds separated by a wide, fast-moving river. On one side is Wall Street, sitting on trillions in stocks, bonds, and real-world assets that have been building for decades. On the other side is crypto, fast, experimental, and constantly evolving, but for a long time completely disconnected from the traditional system. For years, people kept building higher and higher skyscrapers on the crypto side, trying to show strength and innovation, but almost nobody focused on building a real bridge between the two worlds. That gap is where the entire story begins. Now imagine that while everyone was distracted building on their own side of the river, one company quietly spent over a decade doing something completely different. Instead of chasing hype or short-term attention, it focused on building that missing bridge. Not the flashy parts, not the marketing, but the real infrastructure that institutions actually need: compliance systems, regulatory approval paths, banking connections, and financial plumbing that most crypto projects ignore because it is slow, expensive, and unglamorous. But here is where things get interesting. That bridge is no longer just an idea or a future vision. According to insiders, it is now being used more than ever before. Adoption is increasing, institutions are testing it, and major financial players are starting to cross over into this new system. Yet despite all of this activity happening behind the scenes, XRP's price has not moved in the way most people would expect. It has stayed relatively quiet, almost disconnected from the energy building underneath. And that is exactly why this story is starting to attract attention again, because when fundamentals and price stop moving together, something eventually has to give. The person speaking about this situation is not just another influencer or market commentator trying to predict the next pump. His name is being discussed in connection with the early infrastructure building inside Ripple, where he reportedly spent over a decade working on connecting blockchain systems with real financial institutions. This is not someone observing from the outside. This is someone who was inside the room when the early connections between crypto and banks were being built step by step. He understands how slow and difficult that process actually is, because it is not about technology alone. It is about trust, regulation, and global financial compatibility. What makes his perspective even more interesting is that he is now connected to a major institutional treasury strategy built around XRP, holding large-scale positions and building financial structures that depend heavily on XRP's long-term success. That means his view is not just theoretical. It is directly tied to real capital, real exposure, and real financial outcomes. This is where the story becomes even more intense. When random people online talk about XRP, they are usually betting on attention. They want views, engagement, or speculation. But when someone involved in building or managing large-scale XRP-linked financial structures speaks, the incentives are completely different. They are not talking for hype. They are speaking from exposure. That changes how we interpret every statement. Because now it is not just opinion, it is partially a reflection of position. And in this case, the message being sent is that XRP is uniquely positioned as a bridge asset between traditional finance and blockchain systems. Not as a meme, not as a short-term trade, but as infrastructure designed for long-term institutional movement. And when you think about that carefully, it starts to reshape the way you look at everything happening in the market right now. What makes this even more surprising is the contradiction that even insiders admit openly. On one hand, adoption is growing, institutions are testing systems, and tokenization activity is expanding across financial networks. On the other hand, the price chart does not reflect any of this growth in a clean or direct way. It almost looks like two separate realities are existing at the same time. One reality is happening inside financial infrastructure, where things are being built, integrated, and tested. The other reality is happening in the open market, where price action is influenced by macro conditions, liquidity cycles, and broader risk sentiment. Even people deeply involved in the ecosystem describe this situation as unusual, because typically you expect adoption to eventually show up in valuation. But here, the timing feels delayed, almost like the system is still waiting for the moment when everything aligns at once. To understand why this matters, we need to go back to the early days of XRP and how it was viewed by the wider crypto community. In the beginning, many people dismissed XRP because it was seen as too connected to banks and traditional finance. In a space that valued decentralization and independence from institutions, anything tied to the existing financial system was often criticized. XRP was labeled as too corporate or not truly crypto enough. But over time, something interesting happened. The narrative flipped completely. The same critics who once rejected it for being too close to banks started criticizing it for not being decentralized enough or not moving fast enough like pure crypto-native projects. This contradiction reveals something deeper about the market psychology surrounding XRP. It has always sat in an uncomfortable middle position between two worlds, never fully belonging to either side, which also makes it one of the most misunderstood assets in the entire industry. At the core of this debate is a fundamental question that challenges the entire crypto narrative. Can you actually rebuild global finance without involving the institutions that already control most of the world's capital? Or is the real path forward one where new technology has to integrate with existing systems instead of replacing them completely? This is where XRP's strategy becomes clearer. The idea is not to destroy traditional finance, but to connect it, upgrade it, and make it more efficient through blockchain infrastructure. That means XRP is not trying to be digital gold sitting in cold storage waiting for value appreciation alone. Instead, it is designed to function as a working financial layer that helps move value between systems. And whether you agree with that approach or not, it is a fundamentally different philosophy compared to many other crypto projects. This is also why some early critics eventually had to reconsider their stance. The thing they once mocked, being close to banks, started to look less like a weakness and more like a strategic advantage. Because while much of crypto was busy experimenting with ideas that stayed inside the crypto ecosystem, XRP focused on something harder, actually integrating with real financial rails. And that takes time. It takes years of legal frameworks, compliance approvals, partnerships, and system testing. It is not exciting in the short term, but it is exactly the kind of groundwork that institutions require before they move large amounts of capital. And according to supporters of this thesis, that is exactly what has been quietly happening in the background for years. The framework being discussed around XRP's development is often broken into three main components. First is technology, which includes the actual ability to move and settle value efficiently. XRP's network is designed for fast, low-cost transactions and tokenized asset movement, which gives it a functional advantage in certain use cases. But even insiders admit that technology alone is never enough. It might account for a portion of the value proposition, but it does not guarantee adoption. The second component is regulation and compliance, which is often the slowest and most painful part of the process. Without regulatory clarity and institutional approval, no serious financial institution can fully commit. The third component, which is often overlooked, is the connective tissue between systems. This includes partnerships, infrastructure integration, custody solutions, and the ability to actually plug into traditional finance in a meaningful way. That connective tissue is where the real story sits. Because while most of crypto focused on building entirely new ecosystems, XRP focused on making sure those ecosystems could actually interact with existing global finance. Think about treasury systems, liquidity networks, settlement rails, and institutional trading infrastructure. These are not things that trend on social media, but they are essential for real money movement. And according to this perspective, the lack of visible hype does not mean lack of progress. It often means the work is happening in environments that are not publicly visible yet. That is why some believe the real adoption story in XRP is still ahead of the price, not already reflected in it. As this narrative expands, comparisons with other ecosystems naturally come into play. Ethereum, for example, is often described as a foundation for innovation, similar to a research and development environment where new financial and technological ideas are tested. Many of those ideas eventually evolve into their own systems. In that sense, Ethereum becomes a starting point for experimentation. XRP, on the other hand, is positioned as something more focused and specialized. Instead of trying to support every possible use case, it concentrates on one major goal: connecting traditional finance with blockchain infrastructure. That difference in focus is what supporters believe could define its long-term role in the institutional space, especially if global finance continues moving toward tokenization and cross-system liquidity. There are also emerging competitors and alternative approaches trying to solve similar problems, including privacy-focused financial networks. Some of these systems emphasize extreme confidentiality for institutional transactions, aiming to hide activity entirely from public visibility. While that approach has appeal in certain banking environments, it also introduces trade-offs. Full privacy can reduce transparency and limit interoperability with broader systems. XRP's approach is different because it aims to balance institutional privacy needs while still maintaining an open and connected network. The idea is not to create isolated financial silos, but to enable secure movement of value across systems that still need to interact with each other at a global scale. This brings us back to the biggest question of all. If adoption is increasing, institutions are testing systems, and infrastructure is being built, why has price not reacted in the way many expect? The answer, according to this perspective, lies in timing and structure. Macro conditions, interest rates, and global liquidity cycles all play a role in how capital flows into risk assets. At the same time, XRP's efficiency means that large-scale usage does not necessarily create immediate demand pressure on price in the same way people assume. Instead, growth may show up first in utility, integration, and institutional holding patterns before it ever reflects strongly in market valuation. And that is where the final takeaway sits. Infrastructure almost always moves before price. The bridge gets built quietly first, then traffic slowly begins to cross, and only later does the market recognize what has actually been created. That delay between reality and recognition is where most confusion comes from. It is also where opportunity narratives are born, but also where mistakes happen if assumptions are made too early. So the real question is not whether XRP has activity or interest. The real question is how long it takes for that activity to fully translate into visible market impact, and that is something no one can answer with certainty, not even the people closest to the system.